Joining us now, MSNBC senior White House correspondent Vaughn Hilliard, managing partner and director of economic policy research at Veda Partners, Henrietta Treyz, and University of Michigan professor of economics and public policy, Justin Wolfers. Does Donald Trump know what he's preparing for? Does he have a plan, Vaughn? Is there a notebook that he has somewhere in the Oval Office or the dining room next door that says, here's what I'm going to do on what date, and if they respond this way, I'm going to do this? Or is he just waking up and deciding, oh, I'm going to slap more tariffs on this country and that country in the heat of the moment?
Right. It was suggested to me at one point earlier this week that through normal diplomatic channels that each country would be informed of their new tariff rate. And mere minutes later, suddenly the first letters were posted on his Truth Social account. And this really, if you look at the last 6.5 months, I think that what we are watching unfold this week is reflective of what Scott Bessent back in March had called an organic process. And I don't think anybody would be able to describe it in any other way. Peter Navarro was supposed to be his lead trade representative, his lead trade advisor inside of the White House. But he acknowledged to me just this week that he has taken on more of a supportive role and that it's Howard Lutnick and Jamieson Greer who are taking the lead. And that is where it was thrown out just yesterday by Lutnick, one of those lead trade representatives, that maybe 20 more countries would be getting letters here over the next 48 hours. Well, we've got 7 more here today. And when you're looking at those rates, you have Iraq, you have Sri Lanka at 30% tariff rates. And this White House has not been specific as to how they exactly got to these specific rates or what the calculations are or how they are even reciprocal. And of course, this all goes back to what the actual deficit the U.S. runs with each of these countries. And I want to let you listen, though, to the president, because he has not been wholly committed to even August 1st being a firm deadline for each of these going into effect, suggesting that negotiations with each of these countries could continue. And if he were to pause it again, that would amount to the 4th delay of these very specific tariffs. Take a listen to the president.
We didn't move, no. It's always been August 1st. That's when we're paying. A statement was put out today, and I put it out just to make it clear. It wasn't a change. It was August 1st.
And it was a change because it was just on Monday of this week he signed an executive order delaying the tariffs from going into effect on to Wednesday, July 9th, today, and instead push it back to August 1st. So his own statements are running counter to the words of his own executive orders that he is signing from the White House.
So more tariffs today were on copper, Henrietta. He put a 50% tariff on copper imports, a tax essentially on industries that use copper, housing, energy. Energy is interesting because Donald Trump kept saying as he was coming into office that he was going to lower consumer prices by lowering energy. The prices were all up and high, and you go to the grocery stores and bananas cost a lot and strawberries cost a lot and laundry detergent costs a lot because of energy. If you get the energy down, everything would be cheaper. So how does this help that?
This does not help that. And, if you want to combine it with the last week's worth of stuff, the OBBB doesn't help that either. They also took away a whole bunch of clean energy tax credits that also will make all your energy options more expensive. So we have this argument from the White House that sectoral tariffs are not inflationary because 50% tariffs on copper alone aren't going to make a difference to the overall segments of things that people buy for their households every day. But the trouble with that argument is that they also announced yesterday 200% tariffs are coming on pharmaceutical goods. And we know we have a litany of other sectoral tariffs across steel, aluminum, automobiles, aircraft, jet engines. There's more coming on a whole host of different components, including additional pieces that go into your home, like copper. And then adding worse impact to even just that are the 21 new letters that we're getting, with more to come, that hit different states, different nations at different rates and are going to be a sort of perpetual source of uncertainty as opposed to the one-time hit that Secretary Bessent and other cabinet officials like to talk about. So the inflation reaction is expected to come this month in CPI data that comes out next week and throughout the rest of the summer. And that's on estimates from Goldman Sachs on down to us. So it's pretty expensive and extensive.
How are the banks looking at these new, other than these CPI estimates that they're making, how are they looking at Donald Trump's, it seems like there's a new tariff every other day or a new announcement. Are they paying attention to the Truth Social page that he's posting this stuff on?
Oh, yeah, all day, every day. And I would say that the lack of forewarning to the street is a problem. We saw that in the copper markets. I think it was the biggest move in copper markets since the 80s, if I'm not mistaken. These are things that you can have analysts like me say, I heard that they're coming this week. And then, in fact, they did come yesterday. But most of the street is not expecting these updates until the end of the summer. And they're looking at the 270-day increments for the potential for this investigation to be released. So this lack of clarity is creating these dramatic swings in the market, which, of course, is not constructive to a stable free market economy.
Justin, I'm so lost in the sauce on this. I mean, we've been talking about this for months. Every day there's a new tariff. I'm having a hard time keeping track of who's getting what and when, and whether Donald Trump is pausing things or moving deadlines. How does a corporation, how does a business, an importer, an exporter, small and big, how does a consumer keep track of this? How do they prepare for this? What should they be doing?
Katie, the only good thing about this is I get to hang out with you more often, because the more confused we are, occasionally you feel like you've got to call an economist. Let me actually, for the audience at home, actually the letters turn out to be really simple to keep track of. So first of all, take your mind back to April 2. President Trump stood in the Rose Garden and held that big poster up and said, these are the tariff rates I'm going to put on a whole bunch of countries. Markets tanked as they understood how destructive, incoherent, and ridiculous they were. This was a tariff formula that no economist on the planet has stood up for. And so within 7 days, the president was convinced they were a really bad idea. So to save face, he pressed pause. Now, the 90 days are up today. And you know what he's done? He's now sent out the first 21 of these letters. They've suggested the new tariff rate for each of these countries will be almost exactly the same as what he said back in April 2nd, except just to make this a little harder to keep track of, he's added or subtracted a couple of percentage points depending on which country you are, in what, as far as I can tell, is a thoroughly random manner. But at the very least, let's folks inside the White House say that something changed over the last 90 days. But the reality for people at home is, and this is what makes it easy, this is Liberation Day, the summer rerun. It's just the sequel. He's going back to the same policy. If you didn't like it then, you're not going to like this sequel. And I don't quite understand why they think it's going to sell better this time.
I wonder if we can put the markets up on the screen, because when this was initially announced that, you know, the Independence Day stuff and the weeks after, the markets just were in nosedive mode. You know, they were up and down, up and down, up and down, lots of down. We've seen the markets not react as heavily or as dramatically in the past few weeks, other than what Henrietta was saying about the copper markets. Can you explain that, Justin? Why am I looking at the stock market right now, the Dow in the green?
Yeah, so what happened on April 2 back on Liberation Day is Trump announced a set of tariffs as the policy. And they were so shocking that people had baked in that he was Mr. Tariff, that he was tariff man, and it was worse than that. And that's why markets were terrified. What subsequently happened was he backed down on everything. And then we got this new word. People love this word, taco, the claim that Trump always chickens out. And when you talk to people on Wall Street about why they're so calm, they seem to be remarkably of the view that they're certain that Trump is, in fact, a taco, that he will chicken out again. I think they're overstating it. And I would be building in a very, very real risk that he's serious about it. And if that's true, then what's going to happen over the next few weeks through to August 1st is they're slowly going to wake up that these tariffs are coming. And if that's the case, then financial markets are going to react. But that's going to be much more of a slow motion train wreck than the sort of pyrotechnics we saw last time.
There's also news that the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, is doing something unusual, Henrietta, that we haven't seen before. He's starting to criticize the Fed Chair, Jerome Powell. Obviously, his boss has been doing that, Donald Trump. Can you make sense of that? Why is somebody like the Treasury Secretary deciding that it's a wise idea to criticize the Fed Chair?
Well, not to put too fine a point on it, but these are auditions. When I go to meetings with investors and chief economists down to retail investors, the big hedge funds, the only thing anybody wants to talk about is Federal Reserve interest rates and the parlor game behind who is going to become the next Fed shadow chair, which obviously Secretary Bessent is in the running for, and I think making a lot of the president's own claims to sort of bolster his case. The base case expectation on the street is that Scott Bessent will be the next Fed secretary, and the more that he talks about it, the more people pay attention to him in the context of where inflation rates should be and interest rates. And that becomes an integral focus. I'd also draw your attention to the employment numbers. One of the ways and the dual mandate that the Fed has is to keep inflation low and employment high. And half of the employment jobs report that we got on Thursday of last week came from federal government hiring, 74,000 jobs. So this is very much something that is being spearheaded by the White House, whether DOGE is actually firing people or if, in fact, the federal government is hiring 74,000 people in an overall 143,000 person economy. So definitely this is the parlor game around who's going to be the next Fed chair.
Yeah, so if Scott Bessent is the next Fed chair, he's got 11 others that make the decisions alongside him. That's what happens at the Federal Reserve. It's not just Jerome Powell. It's a whole host of people. How much can he listen to Donald Trump? How much sway will he have? What sort of Fed chair might he be, given that Donald Trump appointed him and he's been following through on all this, the tariff stuff that Donald Trump has asked him to do?
It's exactly right. And that's certainly the reality. The Fed, the entire board is going to be important here. But there's two different seats that are going to be filled between now and then. One at the end of this year and then one next May when it would be the actual chair. And those are the two roles that Trump gets to pick. And so the expectation is the closer we get to actually finalizing the next Federal Reserve Board, the more it's going to be stacked in President Trump's favor. And what I would really pay attention to is how specific the president is getting. Every day it increases seemingly the number of rates he'd like to see the president cut by 1, 2, and now it's 3 is the last time I checked. So it's getting hyper specific, and that's what the market is going to respond to in terms of a shadow Fed chair and what they want to see. And do you serve at the pleasure of the president?